Good evening, and welcome to the Unitarian Church of All Souls. I'm Linda Rousseau from the Peace and Justice Task Force of All Souls. The first of our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles is that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. With this in mind, and for more than a decade, the Peace and Justice Task Force has presented programs addressing injustices in our society. We presented programs on such topics as torture at Guantanamo Bay, the inequities of mass incarceration, and the devastating effects of solitary confinement. We've examined restorative justice practices, efforts to bring education, life skills, and confidence-building programs to our prisons, as well as reentry programs for the formerly incarcerated. Currently, we're looking into the harmful effects of racism in our society. In April, All Souls sponsored a presentation by anti-racist speaker Chris Crass, in which we began to look at the part that white people play in systemic structural racism. Tonight, this work will be furthered through exploration of the hard truths of racism presented by our esteemed featured speakers and our testimonial contributors. And now I turn the program over to Bernadette Evangelist of the Big Apple Coffee Party, who, along with the Peace and Justice Task Force, are sponsors of tonight's event. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bernadette Evangelist. I want to welcome you on behalf of Big Apple Coffee Party. Big Apple Coffee Party is a nonpartisan local group of activists who meet and organize on issues we're passionate about. We've spent over 6 years working to get money out of politics, fighting undue corporate influence on our lives, challenging the ideas and influence of the Koch brothers with our Don't Do Coke campaign, protesting fracking, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and lots more. Tonight, we're looking inward. It's been said that white privilege can be defined as not having to think about race. Tonight, we think about race, to see if understanding ourselves can be an important step toward racial justice and equality. Thank you for coming on this journey with us. Before I introduce you to our moderator, our 2 co-sponsors would like to say a word. Victor Pate, New York City organizer for New York Campaign for Alternatives in Isolated Confinement, and Ali Murphy, activist organizer from Occu-Evolve, Occupy Wall Street, will say a word. Victor?
Thank you, Bernadette. Once again, my name is Victor Pate. I am a member and an organizer for the Campaign for Alternative to Isolated Confinement, and I'm so happy and honored to be one of the co-sponsors for this event, and thank you all for coming. Basically, we are the coalition that are advocating for the abolishment of solitary confinement in New York State as it is. We currently are advocating and hopefully to get a bill passed that's called HALT, H-A-L-T, which basically stands for Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement. And as we all know, solitary confinement is one of the worst things that could ever happen to somebody while they are incarcerated, already being incarcerated. To be further incarcerated and inflicted to these torturous conditions is why we are advocating for the passage of the HALT bill. And basically, what we are asking for is that they do away with solitary confinement. They make better oversights for solitary confinement, restrict certain categories of people that were being held in solitary confinement, including the time, and create more humane alternatives, create residential rehabilitation units that will give people an opportunity to transition from solitary confinement by programs, therapy, et cetera, et cetera. And as we know, solitary confinement is psychologically, physiologically, and in all shapes, forms, and fashions can bring on all psychological damages. So we are the campaign, and we are advocating for the campaign and also the passage of the HALT bill. And I ask and point your attention to the table where we have some literature. Hopefully everybody will sign a petition, and thanks once again for everybody for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Ali Murphy. I'm a member of Occu-Evolve, Occupy Wall Street, and the group was formed right after the occupiers were thrown out from Zuccotti Park, and we have been working on social issues, such as labor, housing, and others. I just wanted to tell you that the group was formed by two of members, and one is Robert, and the other one is Mumba, and I just wanted to say that we are one of the co-sponsors of the tonight event. Okay, thank you very much, and thanks again for being here. And before you leave tonight, please stop by our leadership table. We have plenty of information, and if you would like to be a member, or if you would like to be on our website, please sign up our website sheet. Thank you very much. And Occupy is in the house. Thank you.
Joe's the boss. Laurie Daniel Favors is an activist, attorney, and educator. Her book, Afro State of Mind, Memories of a Nappy-Headed Black Girl, inspires girls and women to be proud and feel beautiful in a society that values whiteness above all else. She imagines new possibilities for racial, gender, and social justice. We're very happy to have her with us tonight.
Those of you who have seen me speak before know that I like to introduce myself as a black white supremacist in recovery. And what this means is that, like all of us, I too was indoctrinated with an ideology that said whiteness is more valuable, and all things associated with whiteness were more valuable than I and my people ever could be. That could show up in terms of my hair and having to spend decades unlearning messages that said my hair needed to be straight in order to be beautiful. It might show up in work, where I feel as though I'm forced to take on a different language, a different way of viewing and seeing and participating in the world in order to keep my job, right? White supremacy shows up in many, many ways for a black person. And I'm excited tonight because we're going to have a dialogue where black white supremacists and white supremacists are going to be able to exchange and really challenge each other in ways that we may not often get to, because we are often segregated in our white supremacy circles, be they black, white, or otherwise. We have a number of wonderful speakers this evening who are going to really help illuminate this conversation. And before we get to our keynote speakers, we are really going to focus in on the words from some of our community members, folks who have experienced firsthand the impact of white supremacy, be it personal, be it institutionalized, and any of the ways that it may show up. And we're excited to see what they're going to be sharing with us, because from their personal experiences, we'll then be able to extrapolate and really dissect what this means on an institutional level and what this challenges us to do in our personal lives as we engage in our ability to recover from white supremacy. I often say it's like being addicted to alcohol. You have Alcoholics Anonymous, you must have White Supremacy Anonymous, because there must be safe spaces for us to purge ourselves of this addiction. Yes? This is where you nod and say yes. And just so you don't know, for those of you who don't know, I'm a black church girl, so when I nod and do this, I need encouragement to come back, because that's my way of gauging that we're doing a good job up here, okay? So we are going to start with our first speaker, who is Mr. Terrell Muhammad. And Terrell Muhammad's story is going to be particularly interesting because, as you will note in your program, he himself experienced solitary confinement and now works on a many-pronged level to support individuals and communities who are reclaiming their lives. And as we heard from the gentleman who spoke just a moment ago, solitary confinement and the issues of racism that lead to determining who gets placed in solitary, how long they're placed in solitary, all of these are intertwined for us. And so I'm very much looking forward to Mr. Terrell Muhammad.
I spent 26 years in New York State Department of Corrections, from the age of 19 to the age of 45. I spent 7 years in solitary confinement, uninterrupted. I went to solitary confinement on numerous occasions for infractions that were not violent, just for having maybe too many stamps. One time I missed the count. I didn't get and stand in front of my cell in time, and they took me to the box. And all these times that I went to the box, one of the most amazing things happened. At that particular time in 1979, you had a lot of revolutionary groups inside New York State Prison. Black Panthers, the BLA, Weathermen, Students for Socialist Party, Marx and Leninists. So you had an array of ideals floating around. And I got politicized. See, when I went to prison, I had no understanding about slavery, racism, or institutional racism. But because of the men that were there, they had exposed me to my role and my place in this world. And they said that racism is a continuum that's developed out of slavery. So that while we are in prison, it's the continuum of slavery that was what we call doctored up in the 13th Amendment that controls me in these circumstances. And it's based on racism. Because when I was in the box a few times, there was a guy named Buddy Jacobson. He was a world-famous horse trainer. And he was in the box with me in Clinton down on Morrow. You don't have privileges in the box. He had privileges. He was able to get commissary. He was able to make phone calls. He was able to get visits in the middle of the week. So this is institutional racism. See, even in there, when everybody's in there for a crime, everybody's in there for an offense, but there's a hierarchy that's still based on racism. When I went to prison in '79, white sat on one side, black sat on the other side. This was established by the guards in the institution. This was what you call unwritten rule. Another form that I had experience in there, in Attica, the guards wouldn't talk to the men. In order for you to come out your cell, they hit the bars twice with their stick. When they wanted you to walk, they hit it twice with the stick. It got to the point that the men said that we're not going to adhere to this new foolishness, and what we're going to do is refuse to go to the mess hall or go out. This was like in 1982. These things occurred throughout all of my time, and I got to see from the warden on down. There's certain facilities in New York State that don't have a black correctional officer. We're in the 21st century, people. There's certain facilities that's upstate that actually believe that we belong there. Black and Latinos belong there. And that's why we're there, because their employment. This is a racist idea to think that blacks and Latinos are cannon fodder for prison. But this is the reality that we're faced with. And when we have this discussion, it is a much-needed discussion. It is a discussion way overdue. But when we have this discussion, we have to get out of the blame game and dissipate the anger and be honest in what we talk about so we can rid this foul institution of racism and this idea of racism out of the minds and hearts of people. I really thank you for coming here. See, I didn't want to be long, but I wanted to be strong. You see, because there's others behind me, but I just wanted to lay the foundation and set the table. Do understand, I found out that racism is a continuism from slavery to the 21st century. Thank you.
I particularly appreciated your point about honesty and how honesty can help us to ease some of the tensions that may come up when we talk about these issues. And the idea of the current incarnation of the prison system being an outgrowth of slavery is factually correct. It's in line with what happened, and it's in line with the way our nation was set up. And so I certainly appreciate your contribution to this discussion. And it's important that we remember institutions are a reflection of the people running them, yes? Corporations are people, according to some folks. But we know that the people in those corporations are the ones who are the driving forces. And so when we carry racist ideology into positions and we then make decisions based on that ideology and that framework, it will be a reflection of the internalization of white supremacy that we carry, yeah? Yes? Yes. Yes, yes, okay. Thank you. And so our next speaker is going to be Ms. Regina Smith. And Ms. Smith is going to share with us about the time that she spent behind bars and the punitive effects of a prison system that offers little restorative opportunities. And keeping in mind that if this system is an outgrowth of slavery, let us think as we're hearing these words, what parallels we can find between modern day experiences and the slavery roots that birthed them. Yes? So let's please give Ms. Regina Smith our applause and attention.
I just would like to say, I am a survivor of solitary confinement. Yes, I was in prison. Thank you. Thank you. I made it out alive. However, while in prison, I was called a savage, a barbarian. I was stripped of everything, butt naked, thrown in a room with nothing but a bed on a mattress and a little tiny sink that was filthy. As the guards walked past my cell, they would say little nasty things to me because I didn't know about prison. I didn't know about being in confinement. I just knew that if I didn't follow the rules, they was gonna kill me. I knew that. So I wanted to stay alive. So I had to follow every rule that was presented to me, and that's strip and get in the room. So for the first 30 days of being in solitary confinement, it was so abusive. I wasn't fed properly. You know how they say you get 3 hots in the cots? That's not true. The crackers up there, excuse my French, were very, very hateful. I was already in solitary confinement. Why not feed me? They refused to feed me the 3 meals that each inmate should get. So as time went on after the 30 days, I refused to eat. I really wasn't sure how to handle this. I stayed in solitary confinement for 160 days. And within that time of being in that room by myself, hearing things that may have not been there, seeing things that were not there, experiencing things that I was about to lose my mind. However, all of the correction officers on that log were white, and they were very abusive. After the 30 days, they wouldn't even let me take a shower. And then when I had to write to the administrator or someone to help me, because I really wasn't sure. So every time I put my letter in the envelope and stuck it through the little hole, it's about this big, it would come right back to me. So I would say after maybe 60 days, maybe 45 days, I was able to get 3 meals. I was able to read my Bible. They took away my privileges. They took away my reading privileges. They took away my mail privileges, my food privileges, my visits. After being released from solitary confinement, I had to go to population. And it was really, really hard coming out of solitary confinement for so long. I really wasn't sure. I just really need to let you know that racism is in the prisons full force, and it needs to stop. Thank you very much.
I want to just weave kind of a bit of a thread between the first 2 comments that we heard, and that is looking at, again, those parallels. You're already in solitary. Why not feed me? What kind of inhumane relegation must you have been put to where you're already isolated, seeing things and hearing things that may or may not have been there? Why not feed me? And it's important that, especially in this day and age, in this political atmosphere, with the realities being that they are, that we are clear that the legacy of slavery, the legacy of viewing people as human and not, the legacy of viewing people as of value and of those who are in the class who can be brutalized while I go to church on Sunday. It's important that we recognize the generational dimensions to that, because these things don't come from nowhere. They are passed down the way our beliefs are, the way our culture is, the way our dinner table conversations are, and they're an intimate part of who we are, how we relate to the world, and how we see privilege and how we see the absence of it. So as we're paying attention to our next 2 speakers, it's important that we recognize this didn't come from anywhere, and I know I'm preaching to a great choir, but for those who are in the video audience who may not be in this room and feel this energy, it is important that we're very clear and explicit about the concrete connections between what you all experienced in our lifetime and what our ancestors experienced, both on boats being taken from the continent of Africa and as they endured a life in a similar type of jail, dealing with similar types of confinement, yes? So next we are going to hear from Janet Bocanegra, and she has been an activist on behalf of youth who have been incarcerated and has worked to assure that they get a second chance when they return home to their communities. Because like many of those who are incarcerated now, when our children and our family members come home, they are often left to the exact same travesties of justice that they experienced when they left. And so let's open our hearts as we hear what she has to share.
Brother Muhammad and Sister Regina, my heart goes out to you. These are times when I say I wish I would have known sooner. I was introduced to the juvenile justice system when my youngest son was 14. I'm a mother of 6. The older ones kind of never went through the system. And even going through the court process, I would look around a courthouse where the line was around from the outside and not one young man of Caucasian race, Latinos and African Americans. Visiting my son was also a nightmare because in detention center, you don't even see one young man of one white young person. I will ask the staff members, do you get any white kids that go through this system? And they will say, well, yeah, but we get a phone call and we release them. Traveling to 2 juvenile facilities upstate, it was a nightmare. As a parent, I used to say to staff members, if your child was in this system, is this system good enough? They would say no. I said, so it's not good enough for my child either. I got to experience things with my son who I said, if I do the things that the system is doing to my child, I'll be arrested. The mishandling of young people. If I do that to my son, the child welfare system will be knocking on my door. Fast forwarding a little bit because I know I don't even want to look at the time because I can just go on. Visiting my son at an adult facility when he's still a kid was one of the worst nightmares any young person and any parent can deal with. One thing that I made sure that every week he didn't miss that visit. While he was in solitary confinement, I knew that that was some inhumane torture because if I lock my child up in a room for a couple of hours, that's inhumane. So how can a system treat young people or individuals in a way where you're locked in a room for 23 hours, 1 hour if you're lucky to step out? So I try to make sure that even it was one of the hardest things any parent can experience, just taking him out and seeing him behind a glass, feeding him through a little opening of the glass, maybe as big as this light right here. And not being able to look back because it was going to break my heart leaving my son there. I knew that my son was experiencing things that he wasn't ready to share with me. But I knew that the treatment that I was receiving as a visitor, it was inhumane. So I knew right away that my child was not being treated as a human. I knew that he was being treated as an animal, and we don't even treat animals that way. I decided that the experience that I was going through, I was not going to feel ashamed because it's not a conversation you want to have with your family members. You don't want to sit around a dinner table and say, yeah, my baby's locked up, and, you know, this is where he's at, and, you know, the system is here to reform. No, the system is there to do what it's supposed to do. Kill our people, either physically or mentally. And emotionally, the families. I didn't do any time, but my mind was not okay. I was working full-time with an organization in the public school system, and I knew that I couldn't do that work any longer because my situation with my son started with the school, so I learned about the school-to-prison pipeline. I knew that I couldn't stand and facilitate how to communicate with your child's teacher when teachers are constantly calling the cops on young people. I knew that I couldn't stand and try to build a bridge with families in the school system because the school system was not investing in educating our kids. I learned about the funding that is being used to incarcerate young people. And what I said to the juvenile justice system is, you guys are doing a great job with $300,000 a year per child because you're preparing our young people to go into the adult system. You're not preparing them to go home. I saw that 1-minute sign, and you know, it's very difficult to share an experience that young people and families are dealing with. Prison is not a place for no one. What we need to do is not change the system, is demolish the system. One of the things that my son said to me, because we're not born hating no one, and my son fits the Hispanic and African American, so I already knew that he had a target behind his back. One of the things that we need to do is demolish the system because there's no place for children, there's no place for humans. Investing money in the community where young people live, where families are raising children. We're not investing the same amount of money that we're investing in incarcerating young people. Less than $18,000 for schools, less than $5,000 for after-school programs, and $300,000 to incarcerate a young person.
You mentioned something that brought up for me the idea of intentionality, right? And a lot of times we can comfort ourselves by saying it's just the system, no, it's not intentional, it's just the way things go, right? But when we're talking about something like the 13th Amendment, which was debated, and for those of you who don't know, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery except upon conviction of a crime. Immediately after that amendment is ratified, you have the introduction of the Black Codes, which are crimes that only people with melanin could be convicted of. And immediately after that, you have the birth of the prison industrial complex, right? And we see the rise, the exponential rise of African descendant people being incarcerated. And one of the things I always like to remind people is that it's no coincidence that those of us who were brought here in chains are still living lives largely demarcated by chains, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist. If an alien came from outer space and were to study our brief recent histories, they would be able to fairly easily identify which are the groups that would be dealing with that type of history. Gary Howard, an educator, says that it is no coincidence that those children who are the victims, who are parts of cultures who have been marginalized by the forces of Western white domination, are still the same children who are suffering disproportionately at our schools. And the birth of the school-to-prison pipeline is certainly evidence of that. And so now we're going to hear from Mr. Japower Simon, who himself recently returned home, and we need to applaud that. Recently returned home from a number of facilities, adult and juvenile, and was exposed to the abuses that are resident in all of those spaces. And we're going to hear from him and certainly lend our support emotionally and spiritually as we can, and be blessed by the words that he shares.
How you doing? My name is Japower Simon. I'm a resident from the Bronx, New York, and I'm 20 years old. I did 2 years in the juvenile system at the age of 14. I was released and did 4 years in the adult system. I was currently released in January. I want to say that racism still exists in the prison system. It's just a mental thing. As far as solitary confinement, that's a world inside of another world, because jail was a world inside of a world in the first place. Then for them to put you in solitary confinement is putting you in a whole nother world inside of another world. So, solitary confinement is basically a mental thing. Like, I was in solitary confinement for 6 months, but I didn't let it break me down, because I was a strong-minded individual. For a weak-minded individual, who's gonna break you down? Being in solitary confinement played mind games as me, as far as I caught myself a couple times talking to myself and answering myself. Constantly pacing myself, overthinking too much. Couldn't read, had to shake my leg to go to sleep. While I was in solitary confinement, I was exposed to the COs not letting me take a shower for 12 days. That was the longest I ever been without a shower, for 12 days. I don't think that they being racist because if the COs was pink, I hate all pink people, but it just so happened they Caucasian. So I don't want to say that they being racist, but certain things they do add up to slavery, and jail being the modern day slavery, because the things they say and the things they do don't make you want to say I hate white people or I hate all COs, but that's what it adds up to you saying that, because the things they do make you have flashbacks of things that went on while slavery was going on. As far as them telling you when to eat, when to use the bathroom, when to walk, putting shackles on your feet, handcuffs on you, and things like that make you feel like a slave. But yeah, I was a strong-minded individual and I didn't let it break me down. As far as things they set up for me to do when I come home, they didn't really have a plan for me for coming home. I had to make an own plan for myself, and people that helped me make that plan for myself, returning home to the community, was the people that I love. And the system really didn't put no plan together for me, because if they would have put a plan together for me, it's set up for failure, because that's a revolving door. Because that's a revolving door, and some things people tend to do while they're in jail is adapt to it and get used to it. You getting used to the jail lifestyle. That's not something that you want to do, because when you come home, you want to snap back into reality. You don't want to be looked at as a science project. Oh, he just came home from jail. You don't want to be in uncomfortable vibes And you don't want to be around people that's going to make you feel uncomfortable. You want to be around people that's going to make you feel like a human being. And things they tend to do in jail, the officers tend to look at you as science projects and not a human being. They look at you as a number and not a human being. They look at you as a dollar sign and not a human being. So the things they do make you feel unhuman. So I tell everybody here, just if y'all have people that's in a incarcerated, just make them feel regular and don't make them feel like a science project. And constantly talk to them and pick and play with their mentals, because you don't want to let that incarceration break them down.
Can we actually give all of our speakers thus far a hand? As I was listening to what you were saying, it struck for me that the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And the idea of not having a plan for you after you came home. And that really mirrors our experience collectively, because there was no plan for what was going to happen after slavery. That wasn't in the books. That wasn't a part of the script. That was never supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to be here. And it's important for my black white supremacists in the room that we know that we are the descendant of those who survived, right? We survived. Some of the most brutal, horrific things that could be done to human beings. We are the descendants of those who survived. So when we talk about that strong mental capacity and we talk about our ability to get through by any means necessary, there's a legacy that we're drawing on there. And for my white supremacists, the idea of passive participation in privilege, right? And we need to wrestle with the fact that passive participation in privilege is just as problematic as active engagement in discrimination and segregational ideologies, right? And that's a challenge for us, because the privilege of privilege is being privileged enough to never have to consider that beyond a discussion like this. And so our next speaker is going to hopefully push that envelope a bit. I think he will likely push that envelope quite a bit if you all have had a chance to hear him in the past. And Tim Wise, who is going to be appearing before you next, is a scholar and a philosopher who Brother Cornel West calls a vanilla brother in the tradition of the abolitionist John Brown. And for those of you who know Cornel West, that is high praise indeed, yes? He is an author of more than 7 books. He engages in anti-racist discourse, and he's been featured in a number of documentaries. You can find some of them online. He has a number of books in the back available for sale after this event. And he is going to be challenging some of us to think about these things in ways that we may have thought of before, but may need a little bit of push. He's going to expose some things that will allow us to really wrestle with what it means to be a white supremacist, to be you a black white supremacist or a white supremacist, remembering that we are all addicted to the ideology of white supremacy. So if we could give a hand to Mr. Tim Wise.
Well, first of all, let me thank everyone who made it possible for me to be here with you this evening, and also to all of my panelists that I'm fortunate enough, really honored to be on the stage with. I want to thank you for your stories, because those stories are really the things that frame and set up what I want to share with you. First of all, let us be very clear before I say anything of intellectual or academic substance, that the only reason that I'm standing before you this evening is because I am white, because very few of the offenses that land disproportionately black and brown peoples in jail and prison in this country are offenses that I have not committed. Very few, in fact, I would venture to say none of the nonviolent offenses for which a lot of people are sent to jail for years, often entire lifetimes, are offenses that I have not committed. And yet I am here and have never seen the inside of a jail cell in spite of having committed those offenses. And I want you to think about what that means, because I venture to guess that I'm not the only white person in the room for whom that is true. In fact, a few years ago, I added up all of the crimes that I had committed, the statutes of limitations on which had all expired, so I could now acknowledge them publicly. I'm no fool. I mean, you know, I'm no fool. I mean, I'm going to be honest, but I'm not going to be a fool, right? And I determined that had I indeed been arrested for those crimes, I could have done upwards of 25 years to life, depending on the states in which I might have been arrested for those crimes. It is not an accident that I'm here. And this is what I want to leave you with. If you learn nothing else from the time that I've been allotted, let me make sure you get this. If you remember no other phrase or comment that I make, you might want to write this one down. There are no accidents. There are only precedents. No accidents, only precedents. Those things that precede what we see in front of us right now. See, a few years ago, I started thinking about this because I remember I was at a very nice event and a very nice group of people, lots of nice white liberals. For what that's worth, it is worth almost nothing. And I remember a very nice white liberal standing up and saying, don't our politicians know that it costs 5 times more or 10 times more or 20 times, whatever the ratio is? Don't they know that it costs 10 times more to incarcerate a young person than it does to send them to Harvard? She said this as if she were stunned by the inability of lawmakers to do the math. As if these lawmakers didn't already know this figure that she had just offered. And I remember thinking how incredibly quaint and how incredibly sweet and precious and how naive, because the reality is all of the lawmakers already know the calculus that she has just offered in front of this nice group of mostly white liberal people. Yes, indeed, lawmakers already know that it costs 5 times more or 10 times more to incarcerate than to educate. They already know the $300,000 figure that was offered earlier, and they still incarcerate, which leads us to then conclude there are only one of 2 possible ways to interpret that fact. Either number 1, the people who make laws in this country are incredibly short-sighted and ignorant. But see, I don't buy that, because you don't get that much power if you're stupid. Right. Stupid people don't get that much power. That's not, because if you actually believe stupid people got power, what the hell's wrong with you? Why don't you have some, right? You're smarter than that. You ought to have power, right? So you either have to assume that people are ignorant and just haven't done the math, and oh my God, if I just wrote a really good letter to the editor and they read it, they'd be like, oh my God, I totally have been screwing people for decades. I should probably stop that. You can believe that if you choose, though there's no evidence for it. Or you can assume the second thing is true, which is there are no accidents, only precedents. In other words, the system is, as was said before by at least one person on this panel, doing exactly what it was designed to do. See, if you are standing at the end of a conveyor belt in a sausage factory, and you're shocked that you keep getting sausage at the end of that conveyor belt, you probably ought to remember what the sign on the front of the factory says. It's a sausage factory. So if you're waiting for chicken nuggets at the end of the belt, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You're not going to get chicken nuggets unless you retool the factory. You have to upend it and build a new factory. But sometimes we have the illusion that all this stuff is just by either accident, or we just don't quite have enough money, or we just can't quite figure it out, or we just can't quite get the right formula for equality together. But that's nonsense. And sometimes even some of our best, most critical thinkers fall into that. So a few years ago after Katrina, and I bring up Katrina because I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. It's a city that I love more than any city on earth. It's not the same city that it was, right? But still a city that I love more than any city on earth. After Katrina, you remember, by the way, for those still under the illusion that Mother Nature took out that city, Katrina did almost nothing to my city and to the city that hundreds of thousands of folks called home. It wasn't Mother Nature, it was the construction of inadequate levees by the Corps of Engineers whose money was taken from that to build off-ramps for casinos on the lake. That's why they didn't have enough money to reinforce the levees to withstand even a Category 3 storm, let alone a 4 or a 5. So it wasn't Mother Nature, it was the acts of men. That's right. Men in both the Democratic and Republican Party, both white and black politicians, who decided that the lives of those black poor folk in the lower Ninth Ward, and for that matter, the lives of working class and poor white folk in St. Bernard Parish didn't mean anything. See, not compared to tourist dollars going to the casino. And after that city was inundated by the overtopping of those levees, you remember Spike Lee did a movie, made this really good film, right? When the levees broke. Great film, fantastic documentary, one of the best post-Katrina recollections of what happened. But one thing that Spike said in the film, and he said it in a couple of interviews at that time and since, that always struck me wrong, right? He made a comment you might remember. He said, this was a system failure of monumental proportions. And see, that was when I knew he'd gone wrong on that. because it wasn't a system failure. The only way that you could think what happened to the poor folk of New Orleans, particularly black poor folk, was a system failure is if you believe the system had been set up for them in the first place. And if you believe that, you've never been to the city of New Orleans. For that matter, you've never been to any city in any state in this country. Because when a system was not set up for you and then it proceeds not to serve you, that is not the system failing, friends. That is the system succeeding on the terms for which it was created. Now, we can either deal with that, we can either retool our lens so we understand, and this is not, by the way, meant to be conspiratorial thinking. This is not conspiracy thinking. This is what sociologists call functionalism, right? In other words, the system is set up and it operates the way it does because it works for certain people. Like it works for people that have power. That's why it stays in place. It's not conspiracy. It's not like Wizard of Oz behind the curtain pulling strings, right? It's just that it works for the folks who count. That's why we keep doing standardized testing in schools. That's right. Right? You ask anybody who knows anything about standardized testing if it actually measures ability, they'll all tell you no. I mean, if they're being honest. Most college presidents will tell you, no, that doesn't mean anything. Most admissions officers will tell you that stuff doesn't mean anything, right? The people that write the test believe it means something because they make money off of it, but pretty much everybody else knows that it's nonsense. And yet we keep doing it. Why? Because it works for the people who count, who are overwhelmingly affluent, overwhelmingly white, right? And so we know that test scores go up with zip code, right? So where you live determines how well you do. That has a lot to do with socioeconomics and race. So for the people for whom it works well. Why would they change it? That's functionalism, not conspiracy, right? But that's the system operating as intended. It's not an accident, it's a precedent. And when it comes to schooling, we have a lot of precedent. You can go back to the 1700s. Look what Thomas Jefferson said the school system was meant to do. This is not an accident. It's not about, oh, we just can't quite get the Congress to give us enough money. Oh, Albany won't quite give us enough money. That's a part of it, but there's a bigger problem, right? Going all the way back hundreds of years, Thomas Jefferson, who for whatever reason is considered to be some great educational theorist, right? Because he founded the University of Virginia, so, you know, he's considered to be this brilliant educational philosopher. And what did Jefferson say? What did he say? This brilliant educational thinker, he said that what we needed in America was a system of compulsory schooling for 3 years. So you had to have 3 years of compulsory education. I guess in the 1790s, 3 years was good, right? 3 years, and he was only talking about white folks now. He didn't mean for black folks to get any schooling. He didn't mean for indigenous people whom he sought to exterminate long before Andrew Jackson got around to it, to get any education, right? He was just talking about white folks. He said 3 years of compulsory schooling so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. In other words, Thomas Jefferson thought most white folks were rubbish. See, white folks might not be so quick to defend his legacy if they knew that, right? Oh, he was a founder. We must praise him. Yeah, but he thought most of y'all were trash, just so you know, right? 3 years so we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. In other words, what he was saying was schooling was not about creating equality. It was about creating inequality on purpose. Woodrow Wilson, 100 years later, head of Princeton before he became the president of the United States. What did Wilson say? He said what we needed was one class of people who would receive a liberal education. That was the term for a college education in those days. And another group, much larger by necessity, these are Wilson's words, who would forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. In other words, a very small group of special people are going to get education. The rest of y'all are going to work for us. In other words, education was not meant to create equality, it was meant to create inequality, and I beg to remind you, Wilson was only talking about white folks too. It went without saying that he had no intention, as big of a racist as he was, to provide equal education to folks of color. He was saying education isn't even about promoting equal opportunity for white people. We're going to create aristocracy within aristocracy. That's our purpose. That's why I always find it interesting when I talk to young teachers who just started out in the profession. I ask them why they became teachers. They always say, because education is the great equalizer. Okay, see, you already lost. Really? Education is the great equalizer? In what time has that ever been true? And if you've got Thomas Jefferson and Woodrow Wilson telling you that was never the purpose, at some point you need to believe them. Right? And then you think, well, maybe that's ancient history. Maybe that's changed. No, it hasn't, because 15 years ago, I'm sitting on a Sunday afternoon watching one of the Sunday shows, and Bill Bennett Former Secretary of Education, former drug czar, neither of which job he did very well, but both of which the Reagan administration saw fit to give him. Right? William Bennett's on one of the Sunday shows and he's talking about education. He says, you know what the biggest problem in American education is today? And I was riveted. I can't wait to hear what William Bennett thinks the biggest problem with schools is. He says the biggest problem with schools today is that too many people are going to college. And in that moment, I had this now I should know not to cut Bill Bennett slack, but I was feeling ecumenical that day, and I thought maybe, sometimes you're talking to somebody and your throat catches and you have more to say, but you get caught up and you're like, oh wait, I need to take a sip of water and then I'll be right back with the rest of my thought, like an internal ellipses when you write it out, but now you're speaking it. So I'm thinking maybe he's gonna come back and finish that sentence. Maybe he's gonna say, too many people are going to college, ... who don't have enough money to go. That would have been a legitimate thing to say, right? With student debt having doubled, if not tripled in the last 25 to 30 years. But of course, there were no internal ellipses, there was no comma, there was a period at the end of the sentence. He was saying, too many people are going to college, period, and nobody challenged him on it on the show. And I thought to myself, what is he saying? Who does he mean? Who's he talking about? Is he talking about the mediocre children of mediocre parents who happen to go to prep schools and get C's? And can go on to become president of the United States, because if you're white and get C's at Yale, that's no hindrance. You can even go back to Yale and brag about being a C student as long as you're white. Right? Is that who he's talking about? The rich and mediocre? I don't think so. He's not talking about them. We assume they're going to college and grad school and business school and law school and medical school. They're going to run the universe. He's talking about working class people. And especially people of color, regardless of class. It's the mentality of the slave owner, is it not? It's a mentality that says, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton?
That's right.
So we have a system that is predicated on not providing equal opportunity, because God forbid we have equal opportunity. Those guys that pick up my garbage every Wednesday, who's going to pick up that garbage? If they have a college degree, they're going to think they're too good for it, just like I've been trained to think I am. See, I wouldn't even know where the damn landfill was. I don't know where the recycle facility is. But if those guys don't come and pick up my garbage, we're going to have epidemics on my block. That's how important they are to the health of my community. But they get about $21,000 a year and no union benefits in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, right? But the guy down the block that sells, Viagra makes 6 figures. Now, I'm not knocking Viagra, whatever, I guess it serves its function. But I'm just saying, if that dude doesn't show up to work for 6 weeks, life will go on. If the guys who pick up the trash don't show up for 6 weeks, the block dies. We have bubonic plague and stuff. People are falling out dead. That's how important they are. But we have a system predicated on keeping them down. That's not an accident. That's a precedent, right? Same thing is true in the justice system. There's no accidents, right? You think we're accidentally relating to communities of color the way that police and law enforcement? It's not an accident. All you have to do is look at Ferguson. And I'm not even talking now about the death of Mike Brown. Let's talk about the aftermath of the death of Mike Brown. Let's talk about the fact that when the police rolled up in Ferguson afterward to crush the rebellion and the uprising that was happening there in protest of the mistreatment, not just of Mike Brown, because that stuff had been going on in Ferguson for generations, right? They were using the poor black community of Ferguson as an ATM machine to fund the city. That's what the Justice Department found. And when the cops rolled in, remember how they rolled up? You saw it on the news. They rolled up in tanks, decommissioned military equipment from the Pentagon, straight from the war zone. Why do you need a tank in Ferguson? You ever been in Ferguson? Why do you need a tank? Why did they roll up in camouflage? Ask yourself that. Camo, you know what camo is, right? There's 2 types of camo in this country that I'm aware of. Number 1 is green, meant to blend in with the jungles of Southeast Asia. The other one is tan and sand colored, post-1991 Desert Storm, meant to help you blend in with a sand dune. Y'all ever been to Ferguson? There are no jungles and there are no sand dunes. Unless your camouflage looks like a check cashing outlet, which is the only place poor folks can get money in those communities, my guess is you're not going to blend in Ferguson. So when you roll up in military equipment with military clothing, it's not about keeping you safe. It is about sending a message to the people of that community that you are our enemy. This is Fallujah. You are the enemy. We are at war with our own people. That is not an accident. That is a precedent. And just so we're clear how important it is to understand this, see, I don't think about it as a scholar, as an activist, as an academic, I think about it as a dad. Because I have two daughters, 14 and 12. A couple years ago, I was taking them from school. They're both dancers, right? They're dancing at a dance company downtown in Nashville, at the studio downtown, so it's about an 8-minute drive. And to drive from the school to the dance studio, right, we're driving about halfway down, we get stopped at a red light. And on either side of the street we're on is a public housing community, right? Almost all black, all poor by definition, right? And the youngest of my two daughters, who at that time was 10 and a half, looks around, she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" Now that is a brilliant sociological inquiry. I mean, that is a heavy, important anthropological query for a 10-and-a-half-year-old to engage. And of course, her 12-and-a-half-year-old sister, showing off as older siblings are wont to do. For those of you who have them, you know of which I speak, right? The 12-and-a-half-year-old wants to butt in to show off, right? Automatically, the 10-year-old says, "Why is the neighborhood almost all black?" The 12-year-old, not even letting daddy answer the question, right, just jumps up. She's like, "Redlining," which is scary accurate. I don't know where she heard the term. Like, maybe I mumble that shit in my sleep. Like, I don't know where that came from, but whatever it was, like, she picked up on it. I'm like, damn, that was pretty good. Like, that's one question on the SAT you might get. That's good. Except they'll never put that on the SAT, so who am I fooling, right? Right? She says redlining, and the 10-year-old's like, "Yeah, I don't know what that means." I'm like, "Yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off." But it gave me the opportunity to talk to her, right? And so all of a sudden I realized what the 12-year-old said was very prescient, because what she was saying was, there are no accidents, there are just precedents. This neighborhood didn't become all black by accident, just like that neighborhood over there didn't become all white by accident. And it doesn't look like this with the rundown infrastructure on accident. This happened as a result of policies, redlining among them. Banks saying, "We're not lending to anybody in this neighborhood. We don't care what your credit is. We don't care what your occupation or your income or your education is. You're not getting money." Right? That's what happened. And then at the same time that happened, white folks were able to get FHA loans, VA loans, GI Bill benefits to move to the suburbs at the very same time that the federal and state government in places all around this country, including in New York, right through the middle of the Bronx, for example, were building thoroughfares and highways that cut through black and brown and even poor white neighborhoods and destroyed people of color-owned businesses, destroyed 20% of all black housing from 1950 to 1969. 20% of all black housing in this country was knocked to the ground to make way for interstates and shopping malls and parking lots and garages in the name of urban renewal, in the name of progress, in the name of infrastructure development. That happened in Baltimore, and folks can't figure out why Baltimore's angry. Why are they throwing rocks through the CVS window? I don't know. Why'd you knock down their neighborhood to build the interstate? So we didn't call that violence. It's violence when you throw a rock through the CVS. It's not violence when you destroy people's homes in the name of progress that's going to benefit people out in the suburbs. It's not violence in places like Baltimore when Johns Hopkins University takes federal money, your tax dollars and mine, and does a lead abatement study in the 1990s, which you may or may not have heard of. They took children and families, almost all of them black, and subjected them to lead-infested housing on purpose. Put them in 3 different levels of lead-abated housing. Some of them had most of the lead stripped from the paint, so if you got in one of those, you were lucky. Some of them had a medium level of lead abatement, not quite so lucky. Some of them had virtually no lead abatement, really unlucky, and then they studied the effect of lead poisoning on the blood and the brain development of children. We didn't need to study that anymore. We already knew. But they took black folks, put them in there, bribed them with $50 or $10 or T-shirts or $20 extra in SNAP benefits or whatever. At that time, we're still calling it food stamp benefits, to bribe them to go into there. And what do you know? The folks that were in the most lead-infested housing did worse and had lead poisoning 3 to 4 times what the CDC considers safe. All that was in the name of science. See, if you're black or brown and you throw a rock through the CVS window, you're violent. If Johns Hopkins University, using your money and my money, destroys black and brown lives, that's called science, that's called research, and that isn't called violence, and nobody ever goes to jail. That is our problem, and that's not an accident. That has a precedent that my daughter was affirming when she told her sister that there's something going on here, that the past affects the present. And if we don't understand that history, let's be clear, this historical knowledge, this sociological imagination, I'm not just bringing it up like as an academic point. This is critical, because if we don't understand how the past brings us to this place, If we don't understand the precedent that got us from point A to point B, then we can't understand anything we see. You can't understand how the neighborhood looks if you don't know why it looks that way. You can't understand why the prisons look as they do if you don't know why they look that way. You can't understand why the educational institutions look the way they do if you don't know what came before. You cannot understand a presidential campaign that scapegoats brown people for problems that they did not create unless you understand American history, because the whole history of this country is the history of rich white men telling not rich, usually working class and poor white people, that their enemies are black and brown. Let me repeat, the whole history of this country is the history of rich white men telling working class and poor white people that their enemies are black and brown. We did it in the colonies to split the alliances that were forming between indentured Europeans and African enslaved folks. We did it in the Civil War era in my part of the country, my people telling poor, landless white folks in the South that they admitted it, right? Like the elite, you do understand, like in the South, we didn't play games in the 1800s. They were real clear. The reason they wanted to break away was to protect white supremacy. They said it. They said that was the cornerstone of their government. That was the only reason they get it. They didn't talk about states' rights and some abstract, like people said today, like my people lie today. Like, oh, it was about state. What right were they? Was Mississippi arguing with Pennsylvania about the proper way to roast a pork butt? Like, what do you think the argument was about? The argument was about the ability to enslave other humans. And they admitted it, but how are you going to get poor folks to go fight for that? Because the poor white folks didn't own anybody. So how are you going to get them to go fight to protect rich folks' stuff? See, I got a nice house, y'all, but I'm guessing that if like another country were to invade my neighborhood next week and I called y'all up, I'm like, hey, there's an army down the block ready to take my shit. Will y'all come and fight for it and protect me? My guess is you're not going to do that. You're going to be like, fight for your own stuff, because that would be logical. But in the 1800s, poor white folks were getting suckered, told by rich people, you need to go fight to protect our way of life. Who's us? Who's our way of life? So you have hundreds of thousands of landless European peasants who go out and fight to protect rich man stuff, right? And divides and conquers working class coalitions. Union movement, same thing. You got white folks in the union movement saying, we don't want black folks, Chinese, and Mexicans in our union because it'll, hurt the professionalism of the craft. No, fool, it'll double your union. That's what it'll do. And then when you go out on strike, the boss won't be able to hire the folks you didn't want with you, right? Because if you don't bring the people of color into the union, that's who they're going to hire. They're going to get the black folks, the Chinese, the Mexican folks, put them in your place rather than you having them on the strike line with you. See, fool, you just got took. That's what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. And it has worked generation in and generation out, and it's working now. It's working now. Because when someone stands up and says, we could just build a wall, but not just any wall. Oh, no, not just any wall. A wall like you wouldn't believe. Whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. A wall like I wouldn't believe that's going to, but what is a wall that, first of all, what is a wall I wouldn't believe? What is that even, what is that? Like, unless it's a wall made of butter, I don't know what the hell that is. Like, if it's a butter wall, I totally don't believe that. Anything else I would believe. Other than the fact that Donald Trump isn't going to build it himself, he's going to get brown people to do that, and half of them will be undocumented. That's important to note. But the more important point, right, is that when you say you're going to build a wall that's going to solve all the problems of working people, this is old stuff. This is the colonial mentality of the Virginia elite telling the working class, right, after Bacon's Rebellion, oh, we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. So now you're on our team. Now you're part of the white race. You're one of us. They're your enemy, right? It's the same thing, because you build a wall. How is that going to stop the immiseration of working class people, white or otherwise? How does that work? Like, if you build a wall, does that stop capital from crossing borders? Right? You've seen the video, right? Like back in December, the Carrier plant in Indiana that closed up, and they're moving their plant to Monterrey, Mexico, and the guy comes in from corporate in the nice suit and stands up at the podium and tells all these guys, most of whom are white working class guys, well, sorry, we're moving the plant to Mexico, and everybody's screaming at him. As you can understand, their livelihood's just been taken from them, right? And he's saying, settle down, it was a very hard decision, right? It wasn't a hard decision, right? He says, well, we're trying to stay competitive in a very competitive market. Meanwhile, the parent company of Carrier made record profits the last 3 years. They're not in trouble. They're not in danger of losing any market share, right? They did this to pay back their shareholders. This is about rich white people making more money. Had nothing to do with anything else. But who are those white working class folks who just lost their jobs at Carrier being encouraged to blame by certain folks in this country? The folks in Mexico who took their jobs. They didn't take anything. Those jobs were handed to them so that rich white folks could make more money, taking advantage of a lack of environmental laws, a lack of labor protection. It's not like Mexico's got some big-ass magnet south of the border that they hold up in the air and companies are like, oh shit, I wanted to stay, but I can't. Now I gotta go to Mexico. I have no choice. I'm being driven there by the magnet. That doesn't happen, right? It's all nonsense. But when you say that, capital will always cross borders. Right? It's not like if you build a wall, all of a sudden when you hit that button to try to move your money to a Cayman Island bank account, it goes, oop, boop, hit the wall, sorry. Can't move your money now. They'll still be able to move the plant. They'll still be able to move the capital. And if you have a system that says capital can cross borders and goods can cross borders, but labor can't cross borders, you have by definition rigged the economic game in favor of the haves and against the have-nots. That's Econ 101. It's not complicated. But this divide and conquer, again, it has a precedent if we don't understand that history. If we don't understand how we got from point A to point B to point C all the way down to point Z, then it all seems very confusing, doesn't it? It seems like we're just spinning our wheels and we can't quite figure it out. I would suggest to you that if we recalibrate our lens and if we acknowledge that this system was set up to do exactly what it's doing, and that to some extent it's on autopilot and good people get sucked into it, right? Good people can get sucked. I think there are a lot of good teachers, for instance, with very good intentions who get into a school system rooted in inequity and they get changed by it. I'll even go so far as to say there are good people who go into law enforcement who get changed by it. Here's how I know that. You heard some stories earlier about prison guards and folks in the prisons, right? Several years ago, and I'll close with this, I got a couple minutes left. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to go into the maximum security prison in Nashville, Riverbend Maximum Security Unit 2, which is death row in Tennessee. And I had the opportunity to meet with some of the folks on death row. And I was talking to one of the guards. He was a new guard. Couldn't have been more than 23, 24. Right? And I'm talking to him, and he was so new that his suit didn't even fit. His uniform didn't even fit, right? It was like oversized. It was like 3 sizes too big. The sleeves were down to here, right? He looked ridiculous. He looked like one of those kids in the Spanky and Alfalfa, Our Gang, like things from the 30s or whatever with the oversized. It looked ridiculous, right? And I'm talking to him about the guys on the row. He was guarding the men. There were 2 women on the row in a different facility, but there were 98 men. And I said, talk to me about this. What do you know about these guys, right? And he starts talking. He says, man, like that guy over there, he's an incredible artist. And that guy over there is just an amazing poet. God, you ought to hear his poetry. And that guy over there is just this wonderful storyteller, and he's a musician, and da-da-da-da-da. And he's going on and on and on about all the stuff these guys are beyond their crime. Right? And I'm now talking about guys who I think actually did it, because there were folks in there who I think had been wrongfully accused, but there were some guys that were pretty much straight up like, yeah, you know, they were honest. In fact, one of them, a white guy, said, and this takes me back to your story, white guy who said that he didn't understand white privilege until he got on death row and saw the benefits that he received from the warden and the guards. But back to this guard, I said, so you're telling me all these great stories, and he went on for like 5-6 minutes, and then abruptly he stopped. And I said, what's wrong? He said, I can't talk about that. And I said, well, why not? You're doing a really good job. He said, well, I can't think about that stuff. And I said, why? And he said, because I have to remember who they are and why they're here. And if I allow myself to remember who they are beyond what they did, I won't be able to do my job. Let me suggest to you that if we live in a society that requires of its gatekeepers, whether they're prison guards, cops, teachers, social workers, doctors, or whatever it is, requires them to put aside their humanity in order to put food on their plate, we are living in a society that is dangerous to all of us. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
So that was very inspirational. I'm sure you were all feeling the food that came from that space. And it reminds me of two comments in particular. One is a phrase called Sankofa, which is an Adinkra symbol from the Ashanti people. And the idea of this symbol Sankofa is that one must go back to one's past, embrace it, grapple with it, wrestle with it in order to be able to, one, know where you are today, but then two, to be able to move forward. And I'm also reminded of Neely Fuller Jr., whose quote always sticks with me. And he says that if you don't understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it operates, everything else that you think you understand will only confuse you, right? And so those two quotes really help frame and bookend what it is that we're talking about, because when we're talking about systems that were created to work and they work well, for example, the school system. The school system works very well. It was created for the children of the slaveholding class to benefit that group of people, and yet, not understanding the fullness of white supremacy and how it operates, we integrated our children into a space where they had to be walked in and protected by armed guards, and had the nerve to call it progress, and have not investigated or interrogated the quality or the lack of quality of education that black children have been exposed to ever since, right? Systems. When systems work, they work well, and we have to interrogate whether or not it makes sense to continue with the system and try to tweak it from outside or within, or if we need something far more radical. And I'll give you a brief example. Let's say I'm allowed into your home, because you don't know who I am, and I'm allowed into your home, I knock at your door, you let me in, and being kind, you let me know that this is a home that's been handed down to you for generations. It's a family home, you love it, there's pride in this home, the neighborhood is proud of the home, your family is proud of the home, and then you decide to go get me a cup of tea. You go into the kitchen and you prepare this cup of tea, and when you come back, you find that having let me into your home, I've rearranged your furniture. I took some pictures off your wall and positioned them the way I think is going to be a little bit more appropriate for me. I moved your couches and rearranged the fluffy pillows and put them on the floor, perhaps because I needed something a little bit for me as opposed to you. And at that moment, you have a decision to make. You can either let me stay in the home, give me the tea as opposed to throwing it in my face, and let the furniture stay as it is, or you can get me out of your house, show me the exit, and put your furniture back the way it was intended to be when you decided that that's the way it was intended to be. And when we're talking about disrupting systems, ways of being, ways of thought, we have to interrogate which is going to be the best investment of my time and energy and resource, because all of those things are in precious short supply. Is it the best use of my time and energy to integrate my children into an education system that was designed with the needs of the slaveholding class in mind, or would it be better for me to do what I have to do on my own to educate my children on my own? And I often think about my Jewish brothers and sisters, and I have to sometimes phrase ideas about racism in terms of other types of oppressive systems so that I can become really clear, because again, being a recovering white supremacist, sometimes I have to reorient myself. Would my Jewish brothers and sisters have thought it prudent to integrate their children into an education system designed for the benefit of the Nazi children? And if they would not, we have to think about what it means that we think that these are the types of measures that are going to equate with progress. If it would not work under one system of oppression, we have to really do that hard inquiry and ask ourselves, does it make sense in the system of oppression in which we find ourselves? And with that, I am now happy to introduce to you our next speaker for the evening, Dr. Sam Anderson. And quite frankly, I must be honest, I've had the privilege of following Dr. Anderson for quite some time. He's been a mentor both to me and my husband. And he is the author of the Black Holocaust for Beginners, which is also going to be available in the back for sale. He is a retired mathematics and Black history professor. He has taught math, science, and Black history at various New York City colleges and universities for more than 40 years. He is a wealth of information. We are definitely going to be blessed, and I think this is the perfect way to move beyond what Mr. Wise shared with us. And let us hear from Dr. Anderson at this time.
Thank you for your patience, and thank you, Big Apple Coffee Party, and All Souls Peace and Justice Task Force, and the New York Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, and the Occu-Evolve. Very, very good to have this session. And it's an honor to be on the same stage as the formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters, and Tim Wise, who I've been following for several years and telling people, students and so forth, and having them look at videos of Tim Wise is very, very important. A very rare occasion when you have a white person who is able to be straight up and honest about white supremacy and take that dangerous work. It is dangerous, especially if you're going to the white community. Take that dangerous anti-racist work where it needs to be dealt with. I think Before I start, I just want to make sure that people know that there's going to be, when we're speaking of prisons in the United States, there's going to be a tribute to Sundiata Sadiq here on Saturday at 1 o'clock. So, make sure that if you have time, if you're not at the Left Forum, or if you're at the Left Forum, or you're out shopping, to try to come by here for that. I also like to point out, when the brother was talking about being in prison in 1979, that my comrade in arms, Eddie Ellis, the late Eddie Ellis, we were part of the founding of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party did not start in California. It started in Lowndes County, Alabama, and then came to New York as an entity called the Black Panther Party. Lowndes County was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. Some of us were members of SNCC who felt that what was important was that an organization like the Lowndes County Freedom Organization be also in existence within an urban setting. And to make a very long story short, because of Malcolm's assassination in 1965, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, in which some of us were also members of, was stillborn. And we felt that in May of 1966, that what was developed in Lowndes County should have an urban flavor, and we formed the Black Panther Party, and one of the members was Eddie Ellis. And Eddie Ellis, for those who don't know, was under COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, arrested on a crime that he did not commit and served 20 some odd years in prison in New York State. And he was a great organizer within the prison, and when he came out running. He came out and began to do a lot of organizing for the formerly incarcerated. And for a minute, he was at Medgar Evers College with New Leadership organization, and when the politics of the city got to Edison O. Jackson, he was kicked to the curb. But to make a long story short, Eddie was one of the prime organizers and initiators of the prison reform movement, and now what we call the more radical aspect of it, of the abolitionist movement, to abolish prisons and so forth. I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to give some time to the audience because there's so much stuff that we can deal with. What I want to point out is that what we heard today, we have to go back and look at the roots of what we have heard and what we have witnessed and what we have experienced ourselves. And that root is capitalism. Capitalism is the root cause of racism. All right? It is not a genetic development of white folks. Okay? The root cause of racism in the former United States, white supremacy, and other places in China, Japan, it comes off with another kind of thing, is capitalism. And when we dig down into the historical structure of capitalism, it is one of the most inhumane ideas that humans have ever created. And because if we dig down into it, we look at chattel slavery versus indentured servitude, okay? Indentured servitude existed in humanity for thousands of years. And the fundamental difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery is that if a child, most of the time, if a child is born within indentured servitude, that child becomes a part of the family, free, most of the time. And also, that child is not seen as somebody's capital. In chattel slavery, no matter who impregnated the African woman, that child in that African woman's womb is automatically capital. Automatically. So when Thomas Jefferson, the child molester that he was, raped a 14-year-old black woman and had a child, he did not say that that's my child and that child is free. That child became part of his capital on his plantation over and over again. And that was the norm. The abnormal thing was when a black woman gave birth to a child from a white slave master or overseer, and that child was set free. That was the exception. That was the exception. So at the root of capitalism is this heinous crime, at the very root. And we need to understand that. All laws generate from that, okay? The concept of mortgage generates from that. The French term, mort, death, okay? And it generates, the first set of mortgages in the United States were not on houses, it was on Africans enslaved, okay? So every law that developed within the capitalist system was a law that was shaping, confining, and directing the lives of not only the enslaved African, but the lives of white folks, okay? And Virginia is one good example. The state of Virginia during slavery was a very good example. A historian who's I'm drawing a blank on his name right now. My wife would remember. Huh? No. Your cousin. Right. Reggie, he's a historian at the University of Virginia. He pointed this out to me years ago. He was doing research, and he was pointing out that the laws in Virginia became more and more convoluted in terms of making sure white folks and black folk don't get together. That's right. Why? Because every law that they put out, white folks and black folks found ways of getting together, i.e. having children together, right? Living together. And they made these laws more Byzantine as time went on. And it's because they did not want, as Tim pointed out, they did not want the black folk and the white working class to be together. That just didn't happen. But each time in a state like Virginia, with the social dynamics and so forth, it just didn't work. So we need to understand the origins of this whole thing we call white supremacy, racism. It's rooted in capitalism. And if capitalism continues to exist, racism will continue to exist. Okay? Once we eliminate capitalism, racism will still exist, but there will no longer be a material base for it. It'll be here, mainly. And that's a generational struggle. Generations to get that out of people's minds. As for example, the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, and that meant that the basis of capitalist system no longer existed in Cuba, but racism still exists, okay? And they're struggling with that. There's no longer a material base for its existence, i.e. capitalism, but because it has become so embedded in the society, 500 years of that, it's in people's minds, it's in the culture, and it's a struggle to fight on a daily basis to deal with these issues of racism. Now, fast forwarding to the present level, the present day, in terms of education, and we've talked, Tim have talked a lot about this also this evening. Education, we need to understand the difference, and I think Tim pointed it out. schooling and education, programming and developing one's intellect, okay? Schooling, programming, education, developing one's intellect for the betterment of society and humanity. Schooling, making you loyal consumers who don't know anything about the world. Schooling, okay? And then the double whammy is on Black and Latino children. Schooling, making you loyal consumers that don't know anything about the world on your way to prison. Okay? Or on your way, if you're lucky, on your way to McDonald's for maybe getting a job. Okay? So we need to understand that. And inside of that, and as Tim mentioned about the standardized testing and so forth, inside of that is a whole structure of sorting. A whole structure of sorting. It took about 110 years to devise the sorting system we see today. And it's grounded in something that is fundamentally bogus. It's grounded in the assumption that, one, you can measure intelligence. I mean, there's one intelligence, and that secondly, you can measure it. That's what it's grounded in, okay? And that's false. That's not true. And the founding father of this was a Brit named Sir Cyril Burt. Well, his name was Cyril Burt. Then he did the work for the ruling class, and they knighted him, Sir Cyril Burt. And to make a long story short, he's the father of the intelligence quotient. And when a person was writing his biography, Leon Kamin, the late Leon Kamin, writing his biography, he went and kept writing to Burt about the original work that he did, the original study that he did, that he created intelligence quotients from. And he kept asking him, I see in the footnote, you know, this circle of footnoting, what's going on here? And he got no response. And so he eventually went to England, literally at the man's deathbed, and asked him the question. And Burt said, I made it up. All right? He said, I made it up. I fudged the factors and so forth. But his work was razzle-dazzle. And so the young new field of sociology and psychology, they ate it up. Why? Because he advanced a particular area of mathematics that most of them did not have a clue about, and that was statistics. They didn't have a clue. And so they say, wow, all this stuff, this math, he must be right. And so by 1970, in the 1970s, the state of New York Department of Education said we will no longer require the IQ exam for quote-unquote sorting in our public schools, all right? And that lasted about 10 years because the right came in. The whole right-wing, so-called neoliberal crew came in and just reversed all of that, okay? Because the testing industry became the dominant form of measurements of children's development. And at first, it was not as powerful as we see it in 2016, but it was still there. It was there in great ways. So that the sorting mechanism, the capitalists need sorting of the working class in order to control the working class, and also in order to make money off of the working class. So part of the structure in education is the testing industry. And the testing industry is linked directly to electoral politics. And the direct link is through this umbrella group that the right-wing capitalists have put together. I guess that's redundant, right-wing capitalists, who have put together, called ALEC, A-L-E-C. Inside that, you have all these corporations supporting all these different educational initiatives and so forth, and all of them are created by right-wing education thinkers. There are no liberal education thinkers involved in this. And don't even think about the radical education thinkers. They're deemed insane. They're not part of it. So we have standardized testing embedded into the public school system that by its very core sees that there is no possibility of children of color being equally intelligent to white children. No possibility. If it does happen, it's an exception to the rule. Okay? Over and over and over again. And to show you another example, and this actually happened, but they made a movie out of it, the Educational Testing Service, which is based out of Princeton, was the leading force in the development of the advanced placement tests, the advanced placement exams that are given in some high schools and so forth. Well, in the 80s, in East Los Angeles High School, one of the quote-unquote worst high schools in the city of Los Angeles, was predominantly Chicano students. There was a teacher, a Latino teacher there named Jaime Escalante, who began to teach his calculus, advanced placement calculus, to these quote-unquote unteachable Latinos. And there's a film made out of it called Stand and Deliver that James Olmos played Jaime Escalante. It's good to see. It's good to see. But in reality, what happened was these students excelled on the advanced placement calculus test. They excelled. And the ETS people said they cheated. Okay? And they said they cheated because each one got a question wrong the right way, wrong the same way. And that's, that's because of the way Jaime was teaching them the methods in calculus. So the error would if they made an error, it would be in the same manner, right? But no, these Latino kids, they can't do this. They couldn't excel this way. And so they had a choice. Either forget about it or take the test again in a few days. I think it was 36 hours or 40 hours, a few, very short period. And the next test they were going to give them, they said it's going to be even more difficult than the first one. And so most of them chose to take it. And they excelled on that. And what that meant was that ETS, because of this skewed concept, this bogus nature of standardized tests, ETS went back and had to skew everything in the whole country to the point where they had to rethink everything. And everybody who had planned, who were doing all this test prep, they had to scramble for about 3 years, I think, before they're able to get back in the groove again. Now, why is this happening? It's happened because of the racist assumption, okay, and that the standardized testing stems from the IQ, the intelligence quotient. Because from the intelligence quotient, once that became the norm in measuring human beings, some people got together in these new departments of psychology in the United States, in Stanford particularly, and created, Columbia was one, Princeton was another, University of Chicago was another, but Stanford was the one where they really created these exams, and they called them the Stanford Binet exam. And Binet was a French psychologist who had nothing to do with this. And his name was attached on to make it sound fancy and legitimize it. He had nothing to do. He had nothing to do with it. But anyway, the exam, the assumptions are this, and this one, you can measure intelligence, okay, and there's only one of it. Well, there's only one intelligence, and that the third assumption is that most people are going to be average in terms of intelligence, and that a few people will be above average, and there will be a few people who will be below average. And that's the white reference point. Then when they superimposed this, when they finally began to test black people, they made an assumption that black people's bell curve, if you will be shifted down towards the dumb area, okay? Initially, they weren't testing black people. They said they're dumb anyway. They weren't testing indigenous people. They were dumb anyway. But World War II, and then particularly World War I, and then later World War II began to, they were forced to do this because the Army was using it to sort the soldiers, okay? And so standardized testing became this bogus, quote-unquote, pseudoscience aspect became a central component to public education in the United States to guarantee the sorting mechanism of the working class in general and the black and Latino and indigenous people in particular. Now, the exception that popped up post-Vietnam War, the exception in this is who? The Asian student, okay? That's the exception. Post-Vietnam, 1975 onward, the Asian student began to excel on these exams, okay? All over the country, began to excel. And why? Very simple. In the first generation culture of the Asian community, there was a tight-knit family group pushing the child to do well in school, not questioning the nature of public education in the United States, but you're here in the United States, you're going to do well in school. You're going to study. And in fact, if we can't help you at home, we have some people that will be able to help you on the outside, and you're going to study. From the third grade, particularly, onward, they began to study. Particularly here in New York City, for the specialized high schools, they began to study collectively in the third grade to take that exam to get into the specialized high school. This became a cultural norm within the Chinese American, the Japanese American, the Indian American, the Asian American community on a whole, among working class Asian folk. And it was today, one of the results today is that white folks are upset in New York City because Stuyvesant High School is predominantly Asian. My kid can't get in there. He's intelligent, she's intelligent, but she can't get in. Why? Because the exams are skewed. First, we have to understand, norm referencing testing or standardized exams are already rigged. And then if you don't study the nature of the exam, the content and nature of the exam, then you will have a difficult time taking the exam. Now, the Asian community, they have exams from way back, and like I said, they start in the third grade with this, so they come already equipped. Okay, so we have a challenge before us as enlightened folk here in this room. Folk who are struggling to deal with this issue of racism. And I'm trying to be very concrete with this in New York City. That this public school system has doubled down on imposing a racist construct across the city on all of our children. And by doubling down, meaning we have a mayoral dictatorship called mayoral control. And when you look at that with Bloomberg, 12 years of Bloomberg, multi-billionaire, right? And now the poor Bloomberg commonly known as de Blasio, you have a public education system that's being handed over to the privateers. The hedge funders,
Yes.
okay? Those gamblers on Wall Street, those crooks on Wall Street. Remember now, capitalism foundation is on what? Stolen land and stolen people and the elimination of indigenous people, genocide. And then laws develop from that. And so the hedge funds are the logical outgrowth of that. And these hedge funders, in conjunction with the testing industry and the textbook industry and the instant teacher industry, i.e. Teach for America, where they have these little white kids parachute into our communities. You know what the survival rate of a Teach for America student in New York City is? 18 months. 18 months. So you have all of this. The issue is we need to recognize this as a structure that, as the sister pointed out, that needs to be destroyed. You cannot tweak capitalism. You cannot tweak mayoral control. It's got to go. And we have alternatives. We have viable, workable alternatives, not only to the capitalist system, but right here locally for the time being in public education. And that's based in, that's rooted in the local community running the schools based on education as a human right. Education is a human right. And we have the expertise all throughout this city, all throughout this country. We have the expertise to take this educational system over. And specifically, what I'm trying to do, along with some other people, is just that here in New York City. Just that. The Coalition for Public Education, we've been around several years. We want to make sure that the parents and the teachers and the educators run the school that they're in. And in New York City, run the school system that they're in. Because we are the majority in New York City. We meaning the people of color. Majority in New York City. All right? And we can do that. And on the national level, we're trying to build a similar thing. It's very ambitious, but somebody's got to do it. On the national level, we want to have a membership organization that deals with parents, teachers, and educators taking over their school or their school system, depending on the demographic reality. Because who runs it now are those who are pushing the school-to-prison pipeline. Those are the ones who are running it now. And they are only, if they do anything as liberal as quote-unquote de Blasio does, it's just tweaking what is, okay? Tweaking what is. So I like to leave it there, and we can get into some conversation. There's so much to talk about, but I appreciate your patience, and I thank the sponsors for having us here tonight.
Now, I told y'all you were in for a treat. And so as you are thinking about questions you may like to ask, I see some of you have already found the microphone in the middle. There.
I would like to ask the question, how we know a lot of problems and we know a lot of things. I would like to say, I'm not here to condemn and criticize somebody. I would like to encourage. What can we do to make things better? That's all I have to say.
Of course, we start with a question that in and of itself could be its own panel. So I'm going to punt, and I'm going to have Dr. Anderson and Mr. Wise contribute their thoughts to your question.
I think one of the important things, it's a very good question. One of the important things that we can do, there's so many things that we can do, but one of the important things that we can do is to make sure our young people are aware of the world around them and their history. If they don't know that, then they will not do anything and just go along with the oppression. So that's one, just by maybe giving them a book, or maybe referring them to some video, or maybe talking with them a bit and so forth. That's one. And the other is, I think that you need, as Brother Kwame Ture used to say, you need to be in an organization. You need to be in an organization that's doing something, for the community, or for the struggle in general. If we are not and this is true for white folks too. If we're not in an organization fighting against racism, fighting against capitalism, then a lot of our great ideas, a lot of our energy is being wasted or being used on the other side.
Hi, Stephen Lawrence Costes.
If you could hold your question just one moment. We have a few other responses to that initial question from the panelists, and we'll come right to you.
Is the mic on?
Go right ahead.
I also want to say that I do work with an organization that kind of embrace me learning about the juvenile justice system and doing community capacity building, which is Community Connections for Youth. We train folks around the city, also nationally, on how to work with young people and families to divert them from getting caught up into the system.
That's great.
And one thing I'd like to add to that is a reminder that racism is not a black people problem, right? So it's going to require work on all sides. So the suggestions aren't just directed at one community or the other. And I recall a situation where a young woman approached me after an event and asked, well, what could she do as a white person? It was very reminiscent of the scene in Malcolm X where the young woman approaches Mr. X and asks him what she can do. And my response to her was, you need to go have these conversations with your people. Because a lot of people think, because of a savior complex, that the problem resides in the black community, and so that's where we must pour all of our resources and supports, without recognizing that there is a sickness that is called a supremacy complex, a superiority complex. And if we are not having as vested of conversation in those communities where superiority is allowed to reside, then we have an imbalanced approach to healing, and no one can get well with that approach. Right? Sir, you in the middle?
Hi, Stephen Lawrence Costes of both Occupy Wall Street, NYCGA, and the God is Dead theology movement. I mean, due to I have been not just prejudiced against because I was probably the only white member of the original NAACP office I was at, which is the Rutgers campus in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I've also been discriminated against because of my lack of faith. So naturally, I've been derided out by the Christian right because of my own personal system of beliefs. Now, what can we do to exonerate not just the economy, but to also exonerate the social commons further once racism ends?
In the interest of time, because that is a grand question in and of itself, what happens after we've dealt with racism, right? And that is a space I can only hope we can get to in my lifetime. But I think for the interest of time, and because it is late in the evening, we're going to need to confine our questions to dealing with the issue at hand, which is the prevalence of racism and white supremacy. So I would volunteer our panelists that if they would like to continue the discussion about what happens once we ever get to post-racial America, then that would be fine. But unless any of you have a direct response to that, we can go ahead and move on to a race-specific discourse.
Well, Sam had a really good idea that might just, in the interest of time, do you mind me sharing what you said a second ago? That for the sake of time, maybe if we get a bunch of questions, that one very much included, and just take several questions, and then that way we can sort of hear a bunch of them, and they might be some that we can connect, right, to sort of double up on time.
Excellent.
Hear a bunch of them, one, go back and forth, maybe 4 of them, and then we can sort of take and bite off what we can in the time that we have. So that is one, and we'll keep that one in mind. And then if we can get another one from over there, another one from over here, and another one from over there, and then maybe after 4 or so, right, we'll try to answer what we can, and then we'll take some more.
Can we all agree?
Right? Does that make sense?
There we go. So we'll hold this question in abeyance, and should someone have a response, then we will get to it, and we'll come to this side for our second question in this series, and then we'll come back over here.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, you mentioned that we have to take back our educational system. But how are you going to do that? Because I believe that the educational system, public, that we are providing for our children today, black, white, rich and poor, it's New York City, is going to be the undermining of this country. Because without an educated population, we're going to just destroy ourselves.
Okay.
Thank you for that, and we'll include
Come
that
back
in the
over here.
list.
Get a
Yes,
couple more.
over here.
Me? Thank you so much, you all, for speaking. I really enjoyed it. I work at an after-school program at a charter school in the South Bronx, and my roommate and I talk about this often because he is actually a TFA. He does not like it, but we talk a lot about this charter school in particular, and in a lot of charter schools, there's a prevalence of, as you mentioned, these white paratrooping teachers coming into these predominantly black and Latino and low-income communities. And the interesting thing is there was such a talk about standardized testing, and this charter school, as well as most charter schools, really prides themselves on how well their students do in standardized testing. And I guess my question is, it's kind of contradictory in a lot of senses it just got my mind spinning a lot about there's a lot of these black and Latino kids who are performing extremely well on these tests and being taught by these white teachers, and yet there's like virtually no conversation about the fact that you have really, really rich and privileged white teachers teaching in the South Bronx. And I guess, I don't know, I guess I was just interested in how you would respond to that.
Okay.
Thank you. And we'll take one more in this group.
I don't want to jump the line. This is if people have trouble coming to the line and standing.
Sure.
Wave your hand and I'll wait.
Absolutely.
If you didn't hear her, if you are not able to get up and physically be in the line, please do raise your hand as
Right.
there is a roving mic that can come to where you are. And our final question for this set.
I have pretty much a two-part question. Based on in the city schools, we have parent coordinators or whatever. Is there anything that's in the I don't know, bylaws or whatever, I don't know the terminology to say with these parent coordinators, to say we could have emergency assemblies addressing these issues that we're talking about as far as education is concerned? And if so, how do we keep the fire under them throughout the summer to make sure it's addressed for the standardized testing situation?
Wonderful questions.
Thank
So we have what happens after slavery. We have, or excuse me, racism. Well,
Same
we are
thing.
still in
Same
slavery,
thing.
let's be clear. What happens after racism? How do we retake our education system? And are parent coordinators or other auxiliary members of the school team able to enforce some sort of emergency assembly system that would allow some concrete ways of dealing with these issues? So I'm going to throw those questions to the panel, and feel free to jump in as you may.
You want to go first? Yeah. Well, I think I'll just deal with the school piece real quickly. I think that the idea that we need to retake the school system is very accurate, but let's be very clear. The school system is working relatively well for those for whom it was established. I'm not saying it's working as well as it should, because I would argue that very few of our students, including the students of the elite, are really being encouraged to think overly critically. But then again, they don't have to, right? Because they have the power. They don't have to think critically. They just have to sort of keep their stuff. But I think that one of the things we want to think about, and again, as someone who's been, as most of us on the left have been, highly critical of the charter movement, because we understand whence it comes. We understand its ideological base, which is really not about the liberation of young people. That said, if that structure exists in your state, I say liberation-minded, freedom school-minded pedagogical educators ought to take advantage of those openings and say, you know what, we're going to see how serious you are. We're going to set up a freedom school modeled on the freedom schools in Mississippi in 1964. We're going to set up liberatory pedagogical places like what you're talking about, where the community is going to really control it, because the only thing the school system can do, they have two options, right? They can either say, that's not really what we meant.
That's what happens.
That's what happens here, right? But then they play their hand, and then we understand what they're about, and then we understand what the next move has to be. or they have to give you the ability, just like they do these profiteers, the ability to run a school, in which case you actually might liberate some young people. So I think there are opportunities for us to take advantage of it, if nothing else, to demonstrate the duplicity of the people who are really behind the movement, and then figure out what are some alternative mechanisms, because I think what you were saying is absolutely right. Not only should communities control the schools, they have to be able to pick the teachers. And going back to what we were talking about, the criminal justice system, I think that we're also going to have to get to a place where we're having conversations about communities having the right to actually vote up or down on which cops get to police their streets, as well as which teachers get to walk the halls of their schools. So we've got to talk about self-determination. We've got to talk about autonomy. We've got to talk about the ability of people to control their institutions. And when it comes to this other issue of what happens after racism, I think what Sam said so importantly is you can't just sort of get rid of one of these systems of oppression at a time. Like, this all has to be part of a larger effort to deal with the profit system, to deal with patriarchy, to deal with white supremacy. This is not something, we're not going to deal with racism, this year, and then next year we'll do patriarchy, and the next year we'll do capitalism, and the next year we'll do straight supremacy and transphobia. Like, all of this stuff has to be dealt with in an intersectional way, and if we don't do that, then the planet's not going to survive, no one's going to survive, but it has to all come from an understanding that the system that exploits the planet, the system that overuses resources, is based on the same mentality that exploits labor, the same mentality that exploits black and brown labor in particular, and the resources under the soil of black and brown peoples. So I would argue that white supremacy, or Western supremacy, is at the root of the ecological crisis, militarism, war, and all of those things. And so we have to think of it in that intersectional way. You might want to add some things to that.
Take back to schools, in New York City, we have a history. Community control of schools some 50 some odd years ago was a reality. We can learn from that. Yep. We can learn from that, and we are learning from that. And one of the things that we understand is that power needs to be taken from those 1%ers who have power now in the school system. And that power, that the parents and that the students and the conscious educators have that potential power. Organizing that group of people to take power is the key operative in this whole struggle, right? That's what we're talking about. That's hard work. That's hard work. But that's work that has to be done. There is no other form of work that will transform the public education system in New York City or in the United States. Now, teaching to the test, as TFA does, and so many other places do, teaching to the test, yes, results in getting good scores on the test. It works. But oftentimes I say to parents who show off their test scores, the children's test scores, I say to them one very simple thing. That's nice, but what do they know? Okay? What do they know? The history of standardized tests in the past 25 years has been a history of guaranteeing a Eurocentric, narrow mindset among our young people. Okay? So teaching to the test, and those kids doing well on the test, they come out with a Eurocentric mindset, much more deeply embedded than when I was in school. Okay, so that's that part. Now, parent coordinators in New York City are hired by the principals. End of story.
Well, that was, I'm going to echo on what you said, brother. The parent coordinators were put in the schools by Mayor Bloomberg, taking the power away from the PTA president. So who we need to go to and organize and support are the parent association, the president of the parent association. So the parent coordinator works for the principal. So she's going to do what the principal says, unless we have principals and administrators. I just saw an educator here who's amazing, Josh Laub, who's working with the Department of Education on using different techniques on how to keep children in the school instead of going through the prison pipeline.
And I think that we have to remember that as black parents who are suffering with internalized white supremacy, sometimes we have to tap into our inner white person. The inner white person who's going to be entitled and say, this will not happen here. Because I suggest to you, hear me, I suggest to you that if you had an all-white class being taught by a white person who was using all books written by black people, studying philosophers and thinkers and scientists, all of whom were black, all of whom were clearly African descendant people, you bet your bottom dollar that family is pulling that kid out of that class, because that would not be considered subtle. That would be a blatant form of racism. That parent would see that as a racism. They would not allow it. They would not stand for it, and they would shut that school down. The same way our white brothers and sisters who do not believe in evolution are able to do so and mandate that only creationism is taught in their schools in a country divided by the separation of church and state. So sometimes we just have to tap into our inner entitlement and say, this will not happen here. You will not teach my child these lies. You will not force them to conform, because even if they are successful enough to be as brilliant as a monkey, because a monkey can pass these tests if you train them properly, even if they were to pass the test, are you able to do anything and use your education in any particular way that's going to be a benefit or use to your people? What jobs can you create for the masses of your community that no one else is going to hire? If your education can't do that, and it can only prepare you to go down on Wall Street and be very successful working for white people, you've not been educated, you're properly trained. We have to tap in. We have to tap in, all right? Okay, so I think we're going to go on with, did we get everyone here? Okay, I think we're going to go on with another set of questions.
My name is Nellie Hester Bailey. I'm with WBAI Radio Behind the News and also Black Agenda Radio. Yes. Thank you very much for this very enlightening evening. I have two very quick questions in the broader political framework, and obviously all of this is based on neoliberalism, privatization to reap greater profit for capital. And thank you, Dr. Anderson, for pointing that out, because that is the foundation of it. For Mr. Weiss, did Theodore Allen's The Invention of the White Race inform your work? Was it part of you delving deeper into this? And the reason I ask is because I am somewhat extremely dismayed by the ethnic chauvinism within the white left and its reluctancy to go into those white communities where it is most desperately needed, as opposed to attaching itself or themselves to a black group or movement for legitimacy. So that's number one. Number two, for Dr. Anderson, you talked about Teach for America, and we know that DeRay McKesson, this neoliberal leadership that is being promoted by white corporate America, including the media, is now a rising political star, or is part of your talk and awareness informing audiences and parents about this new Al Sharpton type leadership that is being promoted. And in this instance, we have the case of DeRay McKesson, who came out of the Black Lives Movement. Thank you.
We're going to get two more questions, and then we're going to come back to the...
That's what he is.
Hi, my name is Matt. I just wanted to thank everybody for doing this. It's really good that it's happening. I just wanted to, I'm not sure if people are aware about the fact that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is training apparently like the NYPD and other police around the country. I don't know if that was brought up tonight, but it seems like they're teaching people how to further persecute people by desensitizing them to the violence and the systematic like checkpoints and everything. And I was wondering if that was brought up at all, because I came a little late. The second thing was if people are aware of what happened. They mentioned about the lead. A gentleman mentioned about the lead. I was wondering if people knew about the spraying. Apparently the Army did this. It was declassified from a Freedom of Information Act that they were spraying, I think, on the projects. The Army was spraying on the projects in St. Louis in the 50s. I don't know if that was
in Miami.
But it's like seems to be no end to this. So I just didn't know if people were aware of that. But and also finally about political prisoners. There's over, I'm not sure the whole number, but I think there's over 200 of them right now. And I just want to know how I mean, it seems like any president can just sign a piece of paper. Why is it so hard for that to happen? Why is that not happening? Thanks.
Okay, and final question, sir, and then we'll come back to the rest of you in just a second.
Hi, my name is Nico Gutu. I'm an immigrant. I'm a foreign student from Kenya. I was just wondering that when I came from my country, I'd already gone through college education. But when I came here, nothing was accepted. I had to start all over again to go through the system that they accept here. Although I've been accepted into Colombia right now to start in the fall, but I'm wondering what kind of education. I know I'm going to study refugee studies. The kind of policy that I'm going to study, is it designed for what I really need to know, or is it designed by somebody else? Because I did internship in a refugee resettlement program, where if you come here, because there are different types of education systems all over the world, that if you come here and you are in high school in a different country and you are at the age of 18, so when you come here, you really want to go to high school and finish. But here, the refugee policy is that if you're 18 years old, you have to go to work. You can't go to school. If you go to school, there's no assistance from the government. Right. Thank you.
Okay. So we have do you need a recitation of the questions? Are we good?
I think I know what you want to go first.
In terms of McKisson, who I believe is still running for mayor in Baltimore, no?
It's done.
He's out? Okay, it's finished. Okay, so I think that's the end of the story of, I don't think he's able to be resurrected, but they'll probably try. There are, within the history of the social movements in the United States, there are always people who will come out of the movement hustling, all right? And the Black Lives Matter movement is not an exception to that. And that the issue with the Black Lives Matter movement at this moment is that it needs to be consolidated. There are too many people out there who say that they are Black Lives Matter and they are doing other things for themselves. And McKisson was one of them. Okay. In terms of the political prisoner issue in the United States, political prisoners are in state prisons and federal prisons. So if the President of the United States signs off on a prisoner, it's a federal prison that he's able to sign off, not a state. So it would have to be like an act of Congress or something bigger than just a pardon by the president to get the political prisoners free. And that's why pressure on the political prisoner work needs to be as local in terms of the politicians and the prisons as possible, and coordinated on a national level.
Is Leonard Peltier in federal or state? He's in federal.
Federal. So yes, Obama could release him. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just taking the question about Ted Allen. So yes, the answer is that Ted Allen's work was very instrumental in my understanding of the development of whiteness as a concept. And for those who haven't read Theodore Allen's work, The Invention of the White Race, you certainly should, because it really explicates on a much more in detail level what I was talking about in my presentation, which is the way that whiteness was created really from nothing, taking all of these very disparate Europeans who had spent most of our time killing one another rather than being one big happy team or family, and deciding that we would now cleave to one another under the banner of the white race, which really was not a thing, certainly was not a thing biologically, it was not a thing culturally, it was not a thing ethnically, but it was a thing created, as Alan talked about, really for the perpetuation of an economic order, which we now know as capitalism. So I think that he was instrumental. He wasn't the only one. Alexander Sexton, the African-American theologian Thandeka, who also talks about the way that whiteness was created and reinforced in white people. Noel Ignatieff, there are others, right, who have talked about this in regard to the way whiteness was crafted. And so it was certainly important to me. And in reference to the part of the question regarding how critical it is for white people to, rather than glomming on to black and brown organizations, working in our own communities, nothing could be more important than that insight, because that's not to say we want to work in isolation, because if I'm a person of color, I don't trust the white folks to go off in a room and figure it out on our own. Like, you know, I'm not saying that white folks should just do everything on our own, right? But it's the advice that Malcolm X ultimately, he did not give initially when the young woman at Harvard asked the question, what can I do? His original answer was nothing. When he came back from Mecca, he said he wished he had told her to work with her people. Later, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said the same thing. SNCC ultimately said the same thing in 1967 when it asked the white folks in SNCC, one of whom, by the way, Dottie Zellner was in the room earlier and left, and I didn't get a chance to acknowledge her, but she's someone who was instrumental in, as a white member of SNCC and an activist in SNCC, who was one of those people who was told, along with the other white folks in SNCC, we love you, we don't need you in this contingency, we need you to go work with white folks, and she did, as many others did. I think that's critical, and I think there are white folks right now trying to do that work. There's a group called Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, that is doing that, hundreds of chapters all around the country, getting white folks to engage with white folks, following the lead of those organizations and individuals who did the work historically, and I think that's really critical for us to learn from.
Based on the time we have left, unfortunately, we have time for one more question. So I'm sorry, I've been given the signal. Perhaps you can coalesce and combine it into one, but we have time for the one. So we're going to throw it to you.
Good evening, folks. My name is Bill Johnson from Staten Island. I'm also a member of Occu-Evolve. Back in December 3rd of 2014, I stood outside the district attorney's office on Staten Island waiting for the verdict from the grand jury in the Eric Garner case. In the rain, it came out, no finding. The next day, in the New York Post, columnist Bob McManus described Eric Garner's last moments in his life with the words, there he was, selling Lucy's, one by one by one. Ultimately, Eric Garner was responsible for his own death. I have fought against the injustice of that verdict this past year and a half, but it's with that selective information that my fellow European Americans on Staten Island form their opinions and their perspective on life. Folks, you've been speaking to the choir here tonight. I speak to those people who listen to the Bob McManuses and the Donald Trumps on Staten Island every week. And it's like banging my head against the wall as if I was back in the Golden Gloves and a 6'4" guy was hitting me with that jab all night long. Folks, we have to take what we did here tonight and we have to bring it to 1,000 Staten Islands across the United States. What is going on is not fair. It's not justice for all. The last three words of our creed, liberty and justice for all. So folks, you might feel comfortable for being here, but think about the other communities you're connected to who might have a different attitude that's being expressed tonight. And I challenge my fellow European Americans, go back to those neighborhoods and talk nose to nose with those people who don't get it. Thank you.
So I'm going to take moderator liberty and say thank you for that, what really ended up being a closing comment. And I think that really does give us the charge, right? That really lets us know that what we had here was lovely. It's been wonderful communing with the choir. But we do need to now take this work and go out and move forward. And we thank you for joining us tonight and trust that you will do that.